There has been a significant development on the southern front. Ukrainian soldiers successfully captured a massive weapons and ammunition depot near Pernoy, acquiring valuable resources for the Ukrainian armed forces. The incident is particularly significant because it is the main ammunition point for all Russian forces on the southern front. The Russian army recently sent additional reinforcements to fortify the area. However, Ukrainian special forces set up a large ambush for the arriving reinforcement units. As a result, Ukrainian forces gained control of the forest area north of the Pernoy region. The Ukrainians, now in control of the forest area, have started to explore it using drones. At the same time, additional Russian reinforcement units were discovered. This discovery was extremely advantageous. Ukrainian artillery immediately targeted the reconnaissance units that arrived in the region after intense bombardments. The Russian units fled before reaching the crucial logistics area. Consequently, the Russians are now stranded in the region without reinforcements. Meanwhile, Ukrainian units continued their advance in the forest area north of the Pernoy region. The arsenals found in the forest are now under Ukrainian control. The Ukrainians have started utilizing Russian ammunition and special equipment from the arsenal during their takeover. The introduction of the newly developed Bumblebee has led to the creation of advanced weapons, including flamethrowers, automatic grenade launchers, and ample ammunition. With the ongoing advance in the Pernoy area, Ukrainian forces steadily progress, posing a serious threat to the Russian defensive lines. This threat is intensified by the fact that the Russian units in the region have been deprived of ammunition due to the loss of the largest ammunition depot. However, a problem arises. Ukrainian intelligence units, after investigating the region, have stated that there are many more hidden ammunition depots in the Pernoy region. According to the Ukrainians, these depots are well concealed and cannot be detected by drones. In other words, the Russians have kept their ammunition depots and special bunkers underground to avoid drone strikes. Consequently, Pernoy has become a strategically significant location on the southern front, drawing attention from both sides of the conflict. Prior to the Ukrainian attack, intelligence sources were attempting to locate several Russian ammunition depots in the area. As Ukrainian troops advanced, they seized these valuable stockpiles, further weakening the Russian defenses on the southern front. The fall of Pernoy appears imminent. If the Ukrainian forces manage to gain control of the area, it will leave the Russian defenses without ammunition. The capture of Russian ammunition depots on the southern front would severely impede the supply efforts of Russian troops and potentially deprive them of vital ammunition. Consequently, Russian positions may become vulnerable as they struggle to maintain their defensive capabilities without adequate supplies of ammunition. These events could pave the way for Ukrainian forces to launch their most significant offensive to date, benefiting from the securement of enemy ammunition reserves and possible disruption of Russian supply lines. The Ukrainian armed forces would be in an advantageous position to launch major attacks, potentially altering the course of the conflict and tipping the scales in favor of Ukraine. The successful capture of a large Russian arms depot near Pernoy by the Ukrainian armed forces has completely changed the situation on the southern front. The Russian command on the eastern front has started to deploy a large number of soldiers to the southern front. This indicates the weakening of the Russian defensive lines in the south. The weakening of Russian defense lines in the south has caused alarm among the Russian population in Crimea. The people in the region fear that the Ukrainian army may initiate a significant siege on Crimea. Consequently, many Russians have begun fleeing from Crimea. However, the Russian authorities in the region have made statements to prevent panic among the public. Nevertheless, even Russian officials in the region have started leaving Crimea. As a result, traffic on the Crimean bridge has come to a complete standstill. To address this situation, the Russian Navy has taken a significant step. They have dispatched a landing ship to alleviate the traffic congestion on the Crimean bridge. As the traffic jam on the bridge worsened, the Russian Navy sent an amphibious landing craft to help the stranded cars pass through the Kerch Strait. Due to the increased delays and long queues on the Crimean side of the bridge, this deployment aims to relieve the heightened traffic congestion and facilitate travel between the peninsula and mainland Russia. The reason for the Russian army's intervention in this situation is that they are now supplying the region, and the traffic has become unmanageable. Therefore, the Russian Navy had to step in. According to the latest reports from Russian news sources, a large landing craft has arrived at the Kerch fishing port. Its purpose is to transport cars from the port of Kavkaz in case the traffic situation on the Crimean Bridge deteriorates. More than 260 vehicles have caused significant traffic on the Crimean Bridge. The landing craft that docked in Crimea is attempting to rescue the other stranded vehicles. The traffic jam on the Crimean Bridge has prompted the Russian authorities to take action. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu recently announced plans to send 2 landing craft to Crimea, specifically designed to transport cars through the Kerch Strait. This proactive measure aims to address the growing challenges faced by commuters and travelers who rely on the bridge for transportation. Russian officials in Crimea have been observed relocating their families to Russia and frequently traveling to join them on weekends. Denis Shestakov, the deputy permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in Crimea, mentioned this development, highlighting the difficulties faced by residents and authorities in the region and contributing to the increasing traffic congestion. The deployment of a landing craft by the Russian Navy demonstrates the seriousness with which they regard the situation. Authorities hope that by providing an alternative mode of transportation, they can reduce congestion and increase traffic flow on the Crimean Bridge. This move not only addresses the immediate concerns of commuters but also shows the Russian government's commitment to maintaining vital infrastructure links with Crimea. On the other hand, a very critical statement was made. Russian forces have conducted unsuccessful offensive operations on multiple fronts. The latest report from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reveals that Russian forces have conducted unsuccessful offensive operations on 4 fronts, resulting in numerous clashes between Russian and Ukrainian forces. The report highlights the use of airstrikes, missile strikes, and artillery fire by Russian forces, which have caused casualties and damage to both civilian and industrial infrastructure. According to the report, Russian forces have carried out air and missile strikes on Ukrainian territory, employing S-300 anti-aircraft missiles and Iranian-made shot attack aircraft. However, the air defense units of Ukraine successfully intercepted and destroyed 5 shot attack aircraft. Unfortunately, some attacks have hit industrial and infrastructure facilities in the Dnipropetrovsk and Kirovohrad regions. The Eastern Front is now the main focus of Russian forces. Ukrainian soldiers have successfully defended their positions against Russian attacks, repelling their offensive attempts. However, the report also mentions the absence of assault units being formed on the Volyn and Polisia fronts. It is worth noting that certain units of the Belarusian armed forces are present in the border regions. The Russian Freedom Legion announces plans for more raids in Russian regions. The Freedom Legion of Russia, a group of Russian fighters supporting Ukraine, has announced its intention to carry out additional raids on Russian territory. The Legion's commander, known as Caesar, revealed in an interview with The Observer his ambitious plans to execute multiple operations aimed at liberating their homeland. The group seeks to take advantage of the internal chaos in the Kremlin following Yevgeny Prigozhin's rebellion. Caesar, whose real name is Maximilian Andronikov, provided insights into the recent activities of the Russian Freedom Legion. He described a recent operation near the Russian city of Shebekino as a local raid and reconnaissance operation. Although the Legion relies on the support of the Ukrainian army, Caesar emphasized that when they enter Russian territory, they act independently and make their own decisions. The commander explained that the Legion primarily utilizes armored vehicles obtained from captured Russian storage points in Ukraine. Caesar dismissed the Kremlin's claims of heavy casualties among his fighters, deeming them ridiculous and exaggerated. He believes that Yevgeny Prigozhin's rebellion has weakened the regime of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Caesar predicts that the Putin regime will eventually collapse by the end of 2024. The Legion of Freedom of Russia sees this as an opportunity to advance their mission, liberating their homeland from what they perceive as oppressive rule. The background of the conflict sheds light on the latest developments. The Russian Volunteer Corps and the Russian Freedom Legion jointly announced the liberation of several settlements in Russia's Belgorod Oblast from the Putin regime. However, Russian officials have challenged this claim, declaring their fighters defeated and labeling them saboteurs. Ukrainian Defense Intelligence has confirmed cooperation with Russian volunteer troops, including information exchange. The Russians still hope to defeat Ukraine with numerical superiority. This technique worked well on the Eastern Front at Bakhmut, with great difficulty losing hundreds of soldiers a day. The Russians are advancing meter by meter, foot by foot. Theoretically, Russia could put more than 5 million men in arms, even without modern weapons. This multi-million-dollar army would be an insurmountable problem for Ukraine. Putin is willing to sacrifice as many of his soldiers' lives as it takes to win the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, meanwhile, are already experiencing problems with manpower. Therefore, the only way out is to bet on Western military equipment. Interestingly, Ukraine has a clear counterattack plan which is easy to understand just by looking at the map. None of the Ukrainian commanders are hiding it, only the date of the operation and its details are unknown. Here is how this counteract will take place. First of all, the Ukrainian military will destroy all Russian ammunition depots and all military infrastructure within 150 kilometers of the front line. American GLSDB missiles launched from HIMARS will be able to help with this. The British also promised to supply long-range missiles to Ukraine. Probably these will be Scalp Storm Shadow air missiles with a range of more than 250 kilometers. These missiles can be launched from the Soviet MiG-29 aircraft, and Slovakia has promised to transfer these aircraft to Ukraine. In general, when you hear that the Ukrainian army has started actively striking in the Russian rear, it means that this is preparation for a decisive battle. Then the Ukrainian army, armed with German, American, and British tanks, will have to break through Russian defense fortifications in the south of the country and cut through the so-called corridor to Crimea in about a week. The Ukrainians should reach the shore of the Sea of Azov, encircling the cities of Melitopol and Berdyansk. The entire Russian defense in southern Ukraine rests on 3 points. First is the city of Melitopol, where the Russians have set up many warehouses and barracks for their military. Second is the supply of arms and ammunition from Crimea. Third, there are railroad deliveries through the Volnovakha railway junction. With the new missiles, the Ukrainians will be able to destroy all of this, just as they destroyed hundreds of targets with HIMARS missiles last year. Then the Ukrainian infantry, supported by tanks, will have to break through to the shores of the Sea of Azov. Then Ukraine would again launch several devastating strikes on the Crimean Bridge, putting it out of action. This could also be done with long-range missiles and kamikaze surface drones Ukrainian-made. These drones could damage the supports of the bridge, and the missiles could significantly destroy the railroad tracks. All of this would disrupt supplies from Russia to Crimea. Crimea will find itself surrounded. The Russians will only be able to supply Crimea with ships, but then they risk losing all of their ships. Long-range missiles love to hit big ships. Let me remind you that the Ukrainians have already sunk the largest Russian cruiser, the Moskva, when it came too close to the coast. Without significant supplies, the entire Russian military grouping in Crimea and southern Ukraine will be strategically encircled under the onslaught of Ukrainian infantry. Sooner or later, they would surrender or be destroyed. German Leopard tanks will be the main armored force of the coming battles. 2 types of these tanks will be supplied to Ukraine: Leopard 1A5 and Leopard 2AC5 and Leopards 2A6. The Germans laid the 4 most important characteristics: crew protection, maneuverability, firepower, and fire control system at their core. In this war, tanks do not fight against tanks as in a duel. Therefore, there is no point in comparing the characteristics of Leopard tanks with Russian tanks. They are basically equal. The Leopards only have an advantage in their fire control system and in accuracy. Also, Leopards are more comfortable for the crew. Ukrainian tankers say this tank is made for people. The main purpose of tanks in this war is to support infantry. Tanks must break through enemy fortifications and prepare the way for infantry tanks, destroy enemy firing points, fortifications, machine guns, and modern nests. Also, tanks destroy light armored vehicles and enemy infantry advancing in the field. Let me remind you that after a year of war, Ukraine has lost many of its tanks. Now there were barely enough for defensive operations. And to organize a successful counteroffensive, we need at least 500 additional tanks. Therefore, only Western allies can save Ukraine from disaster. Leopards are ideally suited for combat operations in Ukraine. When the Leopard 2A6 enters the battlefield, it instantly becomes the leader of the battle. The Leopard has a 120mm extended cannon that is capable of firing different types of ammunition with a velocity of 1740 meters per second. The projectile is capable of penetrating 810 millimeters of armor at a distance of 2.5 kilometers. The fire control system and accuracy of fire is incomparable to the Russian ones. Therefore, they can easily conduct night fights with great accuracy against the enemy. The Russians are known to have very big problems with accuracy of fire, not only at night but even in the daytime. The Leopard's engine is not fussy and does not need special fuel additives and can run on regular diesel. The Abrams tank, for example, needs aviation fuel for its turbine engine. Another advantage of Leopards is that they can be easily repaired during combat. Germany has established production of all kinds of spare parts, and Poland has a large repair base for these tanks. Theoretically, a broken tank could be back on the battlefield in a week. Meanwhile, in Russia, there are very serious problems with military equipment. Instead of supplying new Armata T-14 tanks to the front, they started supplying World War II tanks. Recently, they brought back some old T-34 tanks from Laos. They have been slightly upgraded and can certainly fire. But there are big doubts that these Stalin-era tanks will be useful on the battlefield. The Russian tank industry is still unable to produce more than 100 tanks a year. Therefore, it is more focused on repairing old and damaged vehicles. The Russians also have problems with shells for all types of artillery. The Russians use dozens of times more than the Ukrainians in the hope of replenishing their supplies. The Russians are turning to North Korea, Iran, and other small dictatorial regimes to buy from them the very weapons they themselves once sold them. Ukraine has been allocated 300,000 pieces of 155mm ammunition from U.S. depots in Israel. This is quite enough for Ukraine for its general offensive. In addition, Ukraine is being supplied with brand new 152mm shells that are manufactured specifically for Ukraine and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Therefore, I can confidently bet on Ukraine in the upcoming battles. Thanks to Western tanks and armored vehicles as well as other types of high-precision weapons, Ukraine has a better chance of winning. After all, only a Ukrainian victory can put an end to this insane war unleashed by Putin. The Ukrainian war tarnished the reputation of the Moscow army, which suffered significant personnel and military losses and suffered serious losses. The Ukrainian war has disrupted the economy of the Russian Federation. Economic sanctions imposed by Western countries have pushed the Russian economy into recession and threatened its long-term effects, including the country's critical energy sector. It has profoundly changed the geopolitical landscape facing Moscow and Europe. But the Ukrainian war still has two fronts. The conventional one is happening in Ukraine. The prolongation of the war will not only cause the loss of life, material, and moral suffering of the Ukrainian people to increase and the settlements to be turned into rubble, but also Russia and the Russian people will face serious economic, social, and political problems that can last for many years. One of the most affected by the war is the Russian civilians living in Russia. Local people now want the clashes to stop as soon as possible. Mysterious explosions and fires in Russia also support this idea. The events involving the Russian anti-war mass are increasing day by day. In the cities of Russia, there are often a series of mysterious events, the cause of which is unknown. Moscow and St. Petersburg in particular host mysterious eruptions. The people of St. Petersburg, Russia's second largest city, have woken up today with a huge fire and explosions in two different regions. A massive fire in St. Petersburg swept the skies with flames and smoke, raising fears that it was a retaliatory attack on Vladimir Putin's continued invasion of Ukraine. The Russian military warehouse went up in flames and turned to ash after the mysterious fire last night. A military warehouse in St. Petersburg, Russia, was destroyed after an overnight fire for unknown reasons. It was claimed that this warehouse was a military warehouse belonging to the Russians and that ammunition was kept for use in the Ukrainian war. Eyewitnesses in St. Petersburg say explosions were heard first, then smoke rose and flames rose. The fire broke out amid months of mysterious fires in Russia, including fires at oil fields in Siberia and Kursk. The one-story warehouse which turned into ashes after the flames was located on the Sverdlovsk embankment in the city. According to the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Russia, more than 70 firefighters and 80 pieces of equipment were involved in extinguishing the fire. They put out the fire at 7:10 am. It was reported that a total of 400 meters squared of the facility became unusable in the fire. However, we learned that thanks to the coordinated work of firefighters and rescue teams, the spread of the fire to neighboring buildings was prevented, and there was no loss of life. According to the preliminary data, the fire in St. Petersburg followed another fire this morning on the roof of a shop in a village in Russia's Krasnoyarsk region. However, no explanation has yet been made by the authorities about the cause of the fire. In addition, last week, the Arktika tanker ship, which was in the port of St. Petersburg for repairs in Russia, caught fire. The oil tanks surrendered to the flames. While no explanation was given as to the cause of the fires, the allegations of sabotage became stronger. One of the most important fires in this region was the Admiral Kuznetsov fire. A fire broke out on the Admiral Kuznetsov, the only aircraft carrier in the possession of the Russian army, while trying to dock at the Zvezdochka shipyard in the Murmansk region in the northwest of the country. No explanation was given by the authorities about the cause of this fire. The smokescreen behind the mysterious fires and explosions in Russia still exists. We know that the fire in St. Petersburg was not the first fire in Russian cities. It will not be the last fire, as it is not the first. It is not difficult to make this inference. The negative effects of the Ukrainian war are now visible in the Russian people. The attacks of Russian opponents of war and partisans targeting the military depots and important centers in the city draws attention. The anger and rebellion of the Russian people gives way to the flames as the Current Affairs YouTube channel. All of our findings are created by the work and analysis of our field warfare expert team and are based on data from the US, UK, Russia, and Ukraine, Ministries of Defense, and independent war analysis and monitoring sources. Also, according to local social media posts, a military facility was set on fire in Novoy Oskol in Belgorod Oblast. 2 days ago, local Governor Andrei Gridnev claimed that the incident was a temporary fire due to workplace neglect. Again, after the new year, a series of explosions occurred. Heard 4 times in the Crimea. Fires have also been reported recently at oil facilities in Siberia, Bryansk Oblast, and Kursk. Large shopping centers in the Moscow Oblast, a power station in Perm, also burned down. In addition, the huge explosion in the Russian Gazprom natural gas pipeline took its place. Among the actions that made a lot of noise on the agenda, a massive explosion hit one of Russia's largest gas pipelines. With the violence of the explosion, flames and smoke rose into the sky. The fireball was seen for miles in all directions after hitting about 14 miles east of St. Petersburg, the country's second-largest city and Putin's hometown. Ambulances and emergency vehicles flocked to the scene this afternoon. Witnesses in St. Petersburg reported that intensive care vehicles had also arrived at the site of the explosion. One theory for the explosion in the natural gas pipeline is that the explosion may be linked to the war in Ukraine. Explosions and fires in St. Petersburg are particularly striking, as it's known. St. Petersburg is the hometown of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. St. Petersburg was Putin's staunch supporter and stronghold. However, the Ukrainian war also used up the patience of the local people in the city. Now, the burning fire of the anger of the residents of St. Petersburg began to engulf Vladimir Putin. These fits of anger, which started with the mobilization announced in September, give way to the strong revolts of the people of St. Petersburg. Several municipal deputies in St. Petersburg are calling on the Russian State Duma to accuse Vladimir Putin of treason. A local deputy said the voices of those who think that the fires in Russia's 2 most important cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow, were not caused by natural means, but were sabotage, are increasing. What happens after these situations in Russia will depend on how the Russian elite and public view his performance. While some signs of discontent with the Ukraine war have emerged, it is too early to speculate what these mean in terms of Putin's long political life. Still, while it's difficult to predict the outcome of the war or its impact on Putin's time in the Kremlin, there is little doubt that the conflict with Ukraine and its consequences will significantly reduce Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin must contend with a heavily damaged army that will take years to rebuild. Possible years of economic stagnation disconnected from major high-tech imports, a potentially worsening situation for energy exports and future production. An alarmed, alienated and rearmament Europe, and an increasing political isolation that will make Moscow even more dependent on its relationship with China are negative gains of the Russian Federation. In the Ukraine war, Russian leader Vladimir Putin still appears to be committed to his desire to reclaim part of Ukraine. Mr. Putin recognizes Ukraine as historical Russian territory. However, Putin's insistence on the Ukraine war is increasing the cost to Russia day by day. It seems that if the Ukraine war continues, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who was punished with Western sanctions in the first place, is now ostracized by his own people. There is great anger among civilians living in Russia, including anti-war Russians, partisans, and even the people of St. Petersburg who are unwavering supporters of the Russian leader. It is impossible not to see the devastating effects of the Ukrainian war on the Russian people.